Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm the host, Derek Lambert. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm going to be talking to Dr. Richard C. Miller. Dr. Miller, you have an extensive CV. You've been 3 master's degrees. You had your PhD. You know a thing about Christianity as you were one similar to me. We were really crazy, I guess, extreme. There's various forms, of course, flavors of Kool-Aid out there, and we were drinking that stuff. So you have a book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, that is a very dense, very educated, sourced book on antiquity and understanding the Jesus movement in the earliest literature we have, and formulating what I would say is a historical observation of the literature and the cultural background from inscriptions, archaeology. What were the Greeks and Romans and Jews doing and believing before, during, and after this time that we would say the New Testament is claiming to happen, right? First century Judea, Galilee, in this region in the Middle East. And, one of the questions I have recently encountered, or even one of the challenges, I was on a show the other day. It was a discussion that turned into a debate, 4 hours of headache at the end. It went south toward the end. But I said, look, man, we're dealing with literature that's loaded with legend, myth. And they're like, how do you know that? And I'm like, they're on the spot as more like a challenge type thing. And I'm already burning out on my energy here, needing to eat. And I'm like, okay, first of all, if you just compare the genres and look at the types of literature that's contemporaneous to this stuff, you're going to see that that's legend and myth and such. But after the live stream, I realized a better thing that could have been said. You always realize after, and that is, why not go to the ancient, elite, educated people of the world and let them tell you what legend, myth, fabuli, or fables are? And so I brought you, the heavy hitter, classicist, Bible scholar, to come and answer that question.
Oh, yeah. I think well, first off, thanks for having me on the show. I've enjoyed being a part of MythVision all this time. And so it's wonderful to be participating in all of this discussion and sharing my research over the years here on a public platform. And so appreciate that. Thank you, Derek.
Of course.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is lost on people, there's a kind of a myth that's brought, and this has to do with kind of our whole perspective of the ancient world in some ways, that they were somehow more culpable than we are, or more, more naive, I should say, more indulgent in myth than we are today, more, credulous, easily duped by, and they couldn't distinguish between a myth and something that was, presented as plausible or correct,
right?
And a genuine depiction of the ancient world. And so that's just not the case when we go back there. It's kind of like, I think people think that this happened so long ago in such a distant period that people were just psychologically, like the human species was just entirely different in some way. If you think about it, you're only talking about 30 lifetimes ago, maybe less if you're talking about the 2nd century. It's not that long ago.
How many lifetimes?
30.
Okay, got it.
So we're not talking about like Stone Age or like some the recesses of ancient, or prehistoric ancestry or something like this. We're talking about 30 lifetimes ago. The hardware of the human psychology is more or less the same as it was. And so we haven't really changed a whole lot in that regard. Our cultures have changed, our language, and obviously science and this kind of thing. But I would make the case that we are just as indulgent today in superstition and myth and folk belief, and maybe more so. We're like even investing our technologies into this. We're taking whatever breakthroughs we've had in terms of our science and actually enlisting them to continue this kind of endeavor to create myths and to have cultic practice and indulge in non-evidence-based kind of constructions or frameworks for the human experience. And so when you go back then, though, into the ancient writings, you could go back to Lucian in the 2nd century. I have quote I pulled up from him.
Yeah, and I put the source in the description, just so you know.
Yeah, let me see if I could read this. So Lucian was a second century Syrian writer. He was a critic. He was a little bit, he looked with disdain on a lot of the practices at the time, and kind of, especially charlatans. And so he was a critic of early Christians in some ways, and that shines through in his writings. He's complaining in this text about what they called panegyric and encomiastic kind of myth making. This was where you would bestow on somebody. A panegyric was after they died. Often you'd give them an elevated and exalted kind of story, an embellished story that's, romanticized and not tethered well to what actually had happened. And so this was a way of exalting someone in this kind of thing. And he's complaining that that's going on. And some of the more formal history works, you could sometimes find this with regard to especially political figures.
Mm-hmm. Like Caesars and stuff like that, or
exactly. Suetonius would be a great example of that. You're either a complete buffoon in Suetonius, or you're this exalted figure that, and sometimes the same figure, you can go back and forth where you've got legendary embellishment, and then she changes gears and back to this kind of warts and all depiction of a person. And I think we talked about that in a prior. He's a good example of that, really. I think this is the kind of thing that he's complaining about. But he says in one of his writings, now he wrote how to write history was his, how history is written. Literally, it's quomodo historia conscribenda sit, how history is to be written. In other words, he's prescribing this is the way it should be written. And he says in there, history cannot include a lie any more than the windpipe can tolerate anything entering it while swallowing. And so I think this is interesting. John Moles, who's a very famous scholar of a prior generation, who has nothing to do with Christianity, he goes on to write, reflecting on this, ancient historiography aims, or should have aimed, to tell the truth, by which is meant to relate things that actually happened and their established causes. Accordingly, if an ancient historiographer does not tell the truth in that sense, there can only be three explanations. 1, error. 2, dishonesty. 3, misconception of history's true function. And so that was his expert opinion. Now he's a historian of the ancient world, not a specialist in Christian stuff necessarily.
So simply put, as we're defining this going along, because I want to hopefully in this discussion show without a doubt why we know the New Testament is full of fable, legend, myth. And I used all three because I know that people might pick each one and say this one means that, and there's certain definitions, but I wanted to cover all three to just point out, because some say complete myth, some say embellishment or mythologizing, and they would call that legendary, et cetera, et cetera. The list can go on, but you're saying history as these ancients would have seen it as what actually accurately happened as a factual account.
Yeah.
That means if it didn't happen, or if they wrote it and they acted like it did, they're lying, or the three examples you gave. But then there's other categories, correct?
Yeah, I think I want to bring this up, not so much as to a way to frame what historiography was in the ancient world, but just to underscore the more fundamental idea that they knew the difference. The ancient people weren't confused on, any more than we are today, probably less so in some ways, because today people play oftentimes. We sacralize we have got sacred history, and then we've got our regular history. Sacred history, it's almost a complete license nowadays to embellish the hell out of it and just create all sorts of things. And then that's sequestered off, and you're not supposed to criticize that in some way, because that's their beliefs. That's just leave them alone. That's what they think is happened.
Right.
And so, if you go on to, like, say, the wiki page for the resurrection, you'll find, I think, it's improved, but for a long time there was a horribly biased. I can imagine someone in, like, say, Iran or something like that reading our wiki in the West and saying, "Hey, you guys are doing just what we're doing. You're kind of pedestalizing your own Western sacred mythology and making it somehow legitimated in your own academic circles just like we're doing with the Quran here in Tehran, in our Quranic academies and this kind of thing, where it's sort of segregated off, and we treat this a special way, and yet we want to kind of bestow on it this kind of academic legitimation.
Right.
And so we're guilty of, I think, from an outsider's standpoint, we're guilty of that in modern time. In the ancient world, though, I don't think it was quite that way. And it's back to your original point. So you see in the New Testament, basically from end to end, narratives, gospel narratives permuting, in other words, giving analogical kind of variations on the various sorts of story patterns and myths and topoi and tropes that we find all over the place in the ancient world that are registered within the category of folk belief, myth, legend, this kind of thing. And so, and no work to distinguish them, certainly not sufficient work. And so, I mean, if you wanted to like distinguish and say, well, we really did see him on that mountain, and let's do some work, when he was transfigured, and let's do some work to say, this isn't what you think. I know you know this category. You've seen it 1,000 times in all of your literature, but this is different. We really saw him there, and this kind of thing. And so you get that a little bit in 2 Peter 1:16 and 17, where, and now I think that's a 2nd century, pseudonymous text written in kind of a Petrine tradition. But even that's almost a separate issue. What you get there, though, is this, he doth protest too much.
Yeah. These are not cleverly devised, as some would suppose, brethren. Well, who the hell's saying they are?
Exactly.
That's what I want to talk to. Yeah.
You don't have to. It's kind of like, I did not have sex with that woman. Like, you don't have to. You don't have to say that. A lot of people to the contrary. But interestingly, in that passage, the epoptai, the verb there for "we were eyewitnesses of His Majesty," mistranslated in our English Bible all day in almost every translation. If you go to LSJ, that's our big. In fact, my computer right now is sitting on top of my LSJ. It's like this thick. That's the ancient lexicon, the lexicon rather of ancient Greek that is used by classicists all day in terms of Roman Greek and prior and post classical and so forth. If you go and actually look up that verb in there, most of the entries have to do with it being a mystery cult technical term. It's a seer. It's not an eyewitness, and it's not translated as an eyewitness anywhere else. Like, no one says. We're kind of using it as almost like a court record, and we were eyewitnesses of His Majesty, like we're like they're standing forward in some sort of court trial or something. And but really, the word there is seer, kind of like a divine cultic seer in a mystery cult. That's the predominantly where you find that verb popping up is in mystery cults. The seers, the people that are kind of the oracles receiving their kind of their prophetic vision or whatever.
And just if I can comment on what you're saying here and why I love what you're doing, the best way to know, I would imagine, to know the meaning of words and how they're being used is to use them in a cultural historical context and calculate, add up how often they're used in what context. You get an idea of what they're trying to imply. And then it's kind of a heuristic approach. Like you go, oh, okay. Hold up, this is happening here. And that's what happened with the birth narrative. I feel like that's one of the different people who start realizing there's legend and myth in the New Testament, find different things that just make the light bulb goes on that one. It might be birth narratives. It might be resurrection account. It might be walking on water. It might, whatever it may be that seems like, whoa, that seems a little too fanciful for like an everyday, ordinary historical event of what happens in life. And then you find other examples in antiquity, historically, all the way out into the East with figures like Buddha walking on water and things like that. So you have to kind of go, what's going on here? Is this legend just like that is? Or are you going to then say that's not legend either? And then all things go. And now we've got all these figures really doing these accounts. Come on. You know what I mean?
100. Yeah, it becomes a special, like basically the most flagrant example that could be found of special pleading. Like that fallacy ends up just governing that entire frame of thought, right? And so, yeah, and I think though, and if you look at the trajectory, like if you look at where did this go, or what happened thereafter, how were these texts received?
Right.
Were they received as historiological kind of chronicles, or were they allegorized and symbologized? And what about the art? How were these legendary? I mean, I would say that these texts are clearly iconographic legends of originary figures, ideological myths of original figures within the traditions, right? And yet that's what we see also in artistic representation. Like if you see the icons of the saints or the apostles or whatever, I went into a church there, and supposedly it was from the 2nd century in Sinai, Greek Orthodox church. I met all sorts of people there, and we were there as research as doctoral students,
right?
And yeah, we got to see all of their art and things, and it was kind of strange to go into this space that dates back that far,
right?
And their tradition, as they see it, their the way they've carried that forward. If you look at their iconographic, their images, they're very much into their icons, and so you can see these painted images of the saints, Peter, Paul, and so forth. Well, those aren't photographs. That's not they're not aiming in their renditions, even in paint, to present this as an accurate depiction. They've got halos over their heads. They've got there's all sorts of, aspects in those paintings that are clearly meant to aggrandize and to elevate and to create symbols out of these figures, to create templates, even models to emulate. And and that's really, I think, what's going on in these texts. You've got a mix of folk belief, a lot of legend, and this is what they wanted. This was a cultic text. It was meant to perform in a cultic environment. This wasn't meant to inform historians about actual ontological events in time and space.
So let's get into a little bit of the evidence, right? Because people are going, well, we've spent 17 minutes hanging out with you guys, and you've brought up some valid points, interesting, but we haven't seen evidence of the suggestion that the New Testament is loaded with legend or has folklore or whatever it might be. When I say it's loaded with things that didn't actually happen in history, that's my point. So I know several Christians that I very much appreciate, guys like John Dominic Crossan, who I don't follow on many cases, many conclusions, but I can appreciate valuing the legend, valuing mythology, finding meaning and purpose in that, because I think we do it. Even the most staunch materialist in the world is going to find meaning in Lord of the Rings or some type of myth in modern day fiction. It helps inform them, and it helps them articulate the deeper intuitions of humans, I think. And that's what mythology kind of, I think, does, is it kind of exposes that narrative that we all as humans are experiencing. We call consciousness. And so there's a lot to this, and it goes deep, but give us this evidence that shows the New Testament is legend. I mean, he was really born of a virgin, Dr. Miller. He really did walk on water. And yes, he healed the blind and turned water into wine and all of these things. How dare you? Do you hate God or something?
No. I think what's happened is it's been lifted out as Christianity grew out of an ancient context that now is alien to almost all of its interpreters.
Right.
And so now it's this kind of pedestalized, sacralized set of thoughts and creeds and all sorts of commitments and confessions that's structured around that socially. And is no longer in its ancient context. If you go back into its ancient context, you'll see all of that in vivid form. You'll see Dionysus. His signature miracle was to turn water into wine.
Right.
And he was one of the most famous. He was like the rock star demigod of the ancient world. You couldn't get him, and Heracles that was it. Everyone loved those guys. And so Christianity is is coming onto the scene, and the Gospels are competitive texts that are entering that social space within the Hellenistic world and the Roman world. And that's where they're getting traction. And these texts were specifically playing on and riffing on and crafted in such a way that they would show their hero to be superior to, or at least on the par with. Well, with the other ones, so you've got a virgin birth. Well, parthenogenesis was not new to the ancient world. The most famous ruler of the ancient world had a virgin birth. Who is that? Alexander the Great. And so you can go back there, and if I've actually done it in the book, you could compare the birth myth of Alexander the Great right alongside Matthew's divine birth myth and see about, I think I count 18 or something different connections across there where it seems to be templated right after that. Now, Alexander the Great definitely predates the Christian tradition, and Alexander the Great, when Christianity was first in its own inchoate form, was a little known tradition, whereas Alexander the Great was giant. His shadow loomed over the entirety of the Greek East. He dominated all that it meant to rule in that world. He was the ultimate symbol of authority in that world. And so if you wanted to have a king of kings, well, you couldn't avoid Alexander and the stamp that he had on the mind of that time period and world, especially in the Roman world. Most of the histories we have preserved of Alexander are actually Roman reflections on him. And so there's a whole book I actually have in my library here on just how important he was in terms of imitating Alexander by almost every ruler up through that time period. And so it's not surprising that the King of Kings would have a divine birth narrative. Most of the rulers had a demigod kind of embellishment placed on their narrative one way or another, especially, the more prominent ones, but even some that are little known. And I cataloged that in the book. I got tired. I got up to I think it was 100 in my list. I kept a list, and I didn't even include them all in the book because I thought, is anyone going to want to read 11 pages of?
It was a lot. I could show people to hint on this, and might as well, while we're here, show them. I created a documentary that is simplified version of your book to try and help people because it's super dense, and it isn't for the faint of heart. Let's just be honest. You go through a gallery, and I think I documented 77 or 78 that you put in the book, and I was like, that was more than you needed to go through. And there were certain tropes. Should we play it for a second and let people kind of see what the list is, and that'll help emphasize your point?
Yeah. I love what you did with this documentary, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. Forgive me if I butcher some of these names. I'm turning to page 40. You've got Aga, daughter of Alenus, Aeneas, son of Aphrodite, Alcmene, princess of Mycenae and Tyrins, Alcone, queen of Trachis. Forgive me, Alexander the Great. Let me go forward of each of these characters with check marks. But I do want you to look, before we look at those graphs, at this translation sub-theme chart, 1 through 15. So I created these graphs that are going to have the green check mark, and you'll notice that 1 through 15 appears at the very top. The figures are the far left, vertical going top to bottom in alphabetical order. 1 through 15 matches the translation sub-theme graph. So if you need to go fact check under each one, you can, and you can pause the video and you can screenshot and look at both and do that. Let me just show you some of this material because this is really important. As you look, you'll see there's a lot of number 3s, 4s. Those come up a lot. Number 11 comes up a lot in the first one. Keep going down to the next graph. And I want people to pause. So these translation fables, like some of those things that pop up there, Dr. Miller, is like ascensions. The body goes missing. These things, which I totally could see people trying to go that are like wanting the New Testament to be what happened historically. But to like, these are signals that constantly come up in Greek and Roman myth or legends or fables. And these really interesting ones that you would say, okay, that fits like something beyond like people ascending to heaven, or a lightning bolt of Zeus zaps and like saves the day, or they get transformed into a star, maybe the bright and morning one. Anyway, I'm being funny because that's the title. One of the names for Jesus, right, is that he's the bright and morning star. And you get that in Revelation. Of course, many Christians connect that to the idea of the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, or Septuagint. Anyway, those translation fables, for those who haven't seen it, there's a lot of them, 15. And I think at the end of this documentary, it's 4.5 hours long. I go through and list, I think there's 12 of the 15. It might be 11, but it's like 12, I think. Out of 15 of them, Jesus checks off.
Right. Yeah, those are signals. And I think one of the things I want to point out, well, there's two things here. One, I use the term fable in a way that probably is upsetting people in certain ways. I admit that. I'm not trying to upset people. It's what Perrin referred to in his translation of Plutarch, for that many, and many others have created such fables. And he actually gives a list of other translated figures, some of which are in the book, of translated figures. And he refers to them as fables, as fabuli. Now, that's the English translation. The actual Greek verb underneath that, mythologeo, is, obviously mythology. You can see underneath that, to mythologize. And so he classes this as mythology making. And so myth making.
And who is this again? I apologize, I'm multitasking.
Plutarch, the early 2nd century writer, right. Is basically contemporaneous with the gospel writers, and at least after Mark. And so anyway, so I want to just call that out. A fabuli in the ancient world, that this is the Latin term for basically a myth. And so a story, a cherished narrative that stretches credulity, that's outside, that's clearly an invented story that breaks the natural order in some way, that's clearly absurd in that sense, but is presented as a story for its own kind of purposes and edification, often sacralized. And so in this case, it's translation fables. And that's where I came up with that. A translation is somebody that had gone from being mortal to immortal, they gone from being human to divine, etc. And so it's basically a rock star in the ancient world, somebody that has been celebrated and elevated up, and then is bestowed on them kind of demigod traits, oftentimes a narrative that places them within the demigod tradition, in alignment with Heracles and Dionysus, and you go down the list.
So just a comment as we go, those 77 you listed in your book all fit that translation concept of going from a mortal to a divine figure in some way, even though none of them are Xeroxed, none of them are identical. Every account is unique, meaning they're all special and they're all just as true as each other. Am I hinting here at something, Dr. Miller?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And really what I wanted to point out there, and that's why I didn't have to put 77. I could have put, 170 in there, or even 10. I chose that many because I felt like that presented a sufficient cross-section of the sorts of the cluster of patterns, linguistic patterns. And this is the other point I wanted to make.
Yeah. Not parallels.
Yeah, it's not parallels. This is how in ancient texts you register in the reader's mind or the listener's mind, hey, this is that kind of story. Begin to process it in that way. You're used to this story. Now, here comes another one that fits into that. Now, they don't all have the same, it's not like this, like you said, a Xerox stamp or whatever of exactly the same thing, but it'll have many of the same recurring motifs and signals in there. Sometimes it only requires one or two, and classicists don't lose any sleep recognizing those.
Right.
Jesus comes onto the scene. What did you say? 12 or something. He's got as many as anyone, more often. I think he's got more than even Romulus. I don't know. He's basically the constant
in fact,
tradition.
Look, I'll share it real quick just so people can see. Romulus scored 8. I think it was, and he was the highest out of all the figures, even more than Heracles. And Jesus is on the left. Look at all those green checkbox. I mean, he has an heinous, ignoble injustice. Remember now, Jesus, according to the Gospels, was innocent. He gets killed, according to the perception the author's painting.
Right.
And there's so many variations of that. Like, was he a rebel leader who got whitewashed in this text, or was he actually just a guy who was speaking on behalf of the poor, and then he got screwed over by Jewish people and the Romans? You know, there's so many ways people try to tackle this. We don't know for sure. One thing we do know is the story emphasizes he was innocent, and here he is being rectified by resurrection, or really a better one ends up being apotheosis, where he gets translated. Metamorphosis, vanished body, which is why the tomb was empty. And you were the one who showed me Matthew, blew my mind, Dr. Miller, on how the Gospel of Matthew, notice they go to the tomb and the stone's still there. But then when the angel comes down, which is totally factual in history, I'm kidding, rolls away the stone, and then they see he's not in the tomb. What does that symbolize, Dr. Miller?
Well, yeah. How did he get out of the tomb? Now that's a question, right? And so everyone just kind of assumes, well, he's kind of like Gandalf, who, of course, as soon as you start saying Gandalf, then all of a sudden we're into fiction land. But
Yeah.
you know, he somehow had a transcendent body at that point that was able to walk through walls, and okay, well, that's a translation in the ancient world. You know, we're pulling that out and creating a theological kind of category around that. But they already had a category for that in the ancient world that was governing the cultural kind of mindset around how these stories would have been processed. That category, and the readers, the earliest readers for these texts, would have been in these Hellenistic cities where these kind of stories were rife. And so for us to go back and kind of poured in our later theological kind of sequestered frameworks and overlay them into that would be dishonest. And so I'm a historian and someone that's interested in how the early Christian movement got off the ground. Yeah. It just so happens that the earliest interpreters and receivers of these texts admitted as much. You know, like we talked about Justin Martyr, he's going ahead and said, yeah, this is landing squarely within that trope. You know, and so it's an admission right up front. Now he complicates this because as soon as he makes that admission, he's got to figure out what the hell to do with that. But in the ancient world, this would have been an unambiguous kind of effort to place him within that tradition that was longstanding. Now the scandal of it wasn't that another person was installed in the kind of Hall of Fame through apotheosis and translation. It was that this was a backwater Galilean, unknown, relatively obscure and marginal on the grand stage.
Like undeserving of this, according to some.
Executed criminal, you know, I mean, this is scandalous. And so it's the scandal part of it that really the front page news. It's not so much that that this story had another permutation in another text or in another cultic tradition. And so yeah. Go ahead.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry.
Well, you notice, I mean, with myth, there isn't a terrible amount of effort to get the story straight. In fact, that's not even the point. The point was to aggrandize him, not to have this, like, you know, chronicle of live events in the ancient world, you know, ontological events. And so if you see, like, for instance, the ascension narrative, well, where did he ascend? Was it in Jerusalem? Was it on this mountain? Was it in Galilee? At what time and place? Who was there? With all the Gospels, you get a different account.
Right.
They do not square.
Yeah.
And there's no effort to reconcile that. There doesn't seem to be the slightest anxiety about that concern. And so that's because that wasn't even the point. And so, you know, it's the same thing with the origin of Jesus. Each gospel has its own kind of depiction of that in some way. Mark just kind of skips the whole idea. Paul does too, because it's just not a myth that he decided to go with or whatever, or that had even occurred to him at that point. And so, but in the other gospels, one's the Logos. Is that what happened? You know, did the Logos become flesh and dwell among us? You know, this kind of thing. So this is a Platonic system of philosophy? Is that, you know? And so the idea, though, wasn't to try and, we press these things. I think modern systematic theologians try to press these things into these hard, literalistic kind of rubrics. And that was not even the point. They were completely comfortable with having this diverse kind of all these ornaments placed upon their founding figure, and having it be coherent or agree or any of that wasn't even the point.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, a couple
yeah.
things you brought up there is pointing out there's several accounts that don't line up, meaning they have different narrations of what they're trying to do with their story. And I've heard it argued by some who go, oh, there's several accounts of the myth of Heracles. Yeah, there are several accounts of the myth of Asclepius or the myth of this guy or that guy or Dionysus. There are several. I agree. And they don't agree. They contradict. This is what we see in the Gospels. So somebody is picking up on this and realizing we need to, nail various forms of this, probably for their own social groups. Another thing that I loved about your book, which is why I personally, and I appreciate you allowing me to do that, carrying the torch of your work in that documentary, at the end, there was this tidal wave of how do we know what we're looking at? This tidal wave that you've pushed and showed, like, look, you got to go back further into the Greek and Roman world to see how deep and how far this stuff goes. And that when Hellenism hit the Jewish world, where Christianity seems to originate from, out of, in a Hellenistic Jewish world, which means centuries before Christianity is on the scene, Jews are already Hellenized, especially diaspora Jews that are not centrally right there at the heart of Judaism in Jerusalem. They're very mixed, concocting Zeus with Yahweh. There's all sorts of stuff. And there's even arguments to make that Paul's God, because he's literally talking about God, isn't necessarily Yahweh. And I'm not talking about Marcionism necessarily. I'm simply saying the Platonic ultimate, right? The ultimate source of all being. And I just say all this to say that tidal wave forced me to have to mention Philo of Alexandria and Josephus, because you have a clear narrative, the most sacred figure in Judaism. Who is that? Moses. They rewrite how Moses went out. They literally take their most sacred guy, the most sacred scripture about this guy. You read your Hebrew Bible right now, Moses died. He was buried by God in the most technical Hebrew there. God buries him. Many scribes over time did not like that idea because God can't touch unclean things, especially when kosher and the laws start becoming enforced more, especially Maccabean and onward, the Hasmonean dynasty and all. They didn't like that God buried him personally. So they say stuff like they buried him, or they try to third person these things to not have God be the one touching the corpse of Moses. Here's Josephus, here, contemporary to the Gospels. Here is Philo of Alexandria, contemporary to Paul. And they are emphasizing that Moses did not die, but was taken and ascends up to heaven. I mean,
right.
At what point do you start going, yep, I see it. And that's why I emphasize it. Myth vision, pay attention to the myth, right? That's the point. I love it. Sorry, I get excited, but this stuff is amazing to learn.
Right. No, my case should be very simple. It's only that we have a living religion with people hanging on tooth and nail to what, I understand they find the story dear. I get it.
Yeah.
But I'm a historian. I'm not trying to create theological books and this kind of thing to help people with their faith. I want to look at, let's just back off. All you got to do is back off just like one step and take a look at it again. And you see, okay, you've got a demigod son who ascends to heaven, just like 59 other people. And it's not that hard. If that's all you knew, the case would be closed, right? There wouldn't be there's nothing further to talk about, really. It's really, my case is really pretty simple in that sense. Rudolf Bultmann, I think, is an interesting character in New Testament. I'm actually kind of maybe his academic grandson or great grandson or something like that. One of the things he pointed out, is in his New Testament mythology and kind of his classic work on that was, it's pointless to suppose that moving vertically is going to result in someone getting any closer to an ontological place called heaven. We already know enough about cosmology to know that's absurd.
Right, right.
Now, in
What
the
are they
ancient
floating
world,
off to? Like James Webb. Hold on, is that Moses? We just saw Moses. I'm teasing.
Exactly. In the ancient world, maybe they were confused. Like they didn't know. Obviously, they would look up and see the stars, and they thought, "Is that like 5 miles up, or is that what is that?" They didn't have the con. Now we know better, right? Now we know a lot more than they did back then, and so. Is Jesus in Alpha Centauri then? I hate to press it to absurdity, but that's kind of where this is at. You've got grown adults teaching at universities that this is a historical reality, a fixture in Western, in it's not even Western history, but we claim it somehow.
If I can ask one more question, because the wonderful queen of heaven up here named Ashera, aka Ryan, she's expecting a dinner. I'm taking her out to dinner here in a little bit.
Nice.
And I'm going to go with family. But why is that important? Why can't you let people just play make believe? Why can't we allow them to just play make believe? Is it really important that we help people maybe see that what we're dealing with is legend, and that they're not like enforcing the idea that it's historical and everyone should believe these things actually happen and proselytize to the world, etc.?
Well, there's a couple things there. One, I am a historian, and so it is my job. I'm not a preacher. I'm not somebody trying to run a religious society or something. It's my job. That's my intellectual. That's me being moral intellectually, is to tell the truth about these things and to be honest and unbiased as much as I can, in presenting these, just like I would any other of these ancient stories. I don't have any confusion over Apollonius, who was, it's a competing cult right next to Christianity for quite a while. It could have won out had the empire not adopted the Christian tradition, but he also ascends to heaven in those texts. I don't think any historian of antiquity is confused over how to interpret that.
Yeah.
And so, there's that. There's also, I think, now this comes from my other, my concern over mental health. And this is going to sound a little crazy, but I think honestly that our ability cognitively to discern reality from non-reality is a centerpiece to our mental health. And in fact, many of the diagnoses, if you look in the DSM-5 and 4 and those in the manual for psychological kind of maladies and problems, a lot of it comes down to the slippage of the cognitive slippage in that area, the ability, delusion and this sort of thing. And religion is somehow kind of a place that's given a license. We're sort of like it's kind of a no-go place for criticism in some ways, willfully indulging the mind in that slippage, that confusion. You've got somebody that could be in every other respect in their life completely rational, but then when they get over to this particular domain in their thinking, all the rules go out the window. And I see that as a problem, not as a solution. I see it as problematic. They might be comforts, but in as far as we're being irrational about them, they're false comforts.
And look, I'm going to be upfront, and then I got to get these super chats before we go, because I hate leaving people hanging, and I appreciate the love and support and doing this. I love that I'm able to do this. It's something I love doing. And that is, I don't want to take people's hope. I understand life is hard. And I know we talked about this in one of the previous interviews that I finally launched when I interviewed you, 8 months ago or something. We came down and saw you, and we hung out with the fam, had a good time. And I plan on doing that again. Is that, some people, I get wanting to think even something that's outside of the rational mind, or something, hoping that something's beyond. That is totally, I would almost say, instinctual and, survival, right? We're all wanting to survive. So there's this aspect about us that's like, I don't want this to be the end of the party. The party cannot end. I hope, I wish, I want the party to continue. For some want it to end and that's it. They say, I don't know. I can't read their mind and know how factual or truthful that is. But like for me, I imagine people it's subjective. So I imagine some people are like, when I go, I can't wait to rest in peace. You know what I mean? And shut off. But that was just my little comment, is like, you and me relate in that. Like, someone's family member died, goodness, we can get irrational. We can think in ways that, and I feel like that's a place they can go to that sometimes helps them. And we can find examples where I imagine irrationality might make them psychologically satisfied, even if it's not factual. But then there's other cases where I would look at it and go, you saw the four kids that were drowned by the mom who heard the voice of God, right? And she was reading her Bible and she was involved deeply in this biblical cult. And I was watching a documentary about this guy. Oh gosh, I can't get lost on it. We don't have the time, but it's really wild. She went from somewhat normal to full blown insane and following this cultic path. So any words from you before we take super chats? So.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I would even go so much further. I mean, the saying, you know, that the truth will liberate you, right? The truth will set you free. I agree with that. That goes back to Plato and Aristotle and others, but Socrates, perhaps. The idea that by turning the lights on and seeing reality, life on life's terms, reality as it truly is, that's ultimately liberating. I mean, there could be a kind of morphine in indulging the mind in a fantasy world in some way. But ultimately, though, as much as I can, I want to be engaged in reality because I feel like that's the least suffering path. You know, if you understand things the way they truly are, you're not prone to make misjudgments and create more problems.
Right.
So.
And I just want to say that I can relate to that too, as someone who recovered from alcohol and drug addiction and things like that over 8 years ago. I really believe this. And then super chats. That is finding what I think is closer to reality as this risen primate on this planet with a loving family. It has helped my mental health, and it has helped me actually have better control over my cognitive faculties and helping me not go back to addiction. And so many people run to God to get saved from their addiction. I get it. I've done that several times. I had 2 years clean. I was in AA and NA, and I dove deep into these meetings and things. And then, you know, I got to this place where I finally start deconverting and really like almost honing in on different ideas, different kind of philosophical ideas that helped me. And then also a scientific mindset. Like, why did I have addiction? And all of that started helping me. Instead of when the church used to tell me you have spiritual malady, you need to go, you know, there's certain spiritual problems that are flawing you, which is why you're doing this, or demons. And that was even earlier when I was in more non-denominational kind of stuff. These are demoniac, like demons that are influencing you and causing you to do these things. So, okay, sorry. Super chats. Constellation Pegasus has been here forever. You are the Moses of this stream. No, I'm just kidding. Says, was the Hebrew Torah finalized in the time of Jesus? That's a Hebrew Torah. If we mean the first 5 books, I would say yes. Because Josephus mentions that the 5 books were written by Moses, and so does Philo of Alexandria. But I don't know if they call it Torah yet, but it's definitely established part of Judaism by this period. I'm commenting on
the law, right? So whether it had received, and we've got the Pentateuch, obviously, and the Septuagint and this sort of thing translated prior to the time of the New Testament, largely, very, mostly aligns right over the top, and I would see that as pretty clearly galvanized at that point in history. Yeah.
I still don't think there's a canon yet, though. That's something later. But the idea of the law and Moses having written these things, yeah, that was established. They thought, which now that's a whole nother. JC, modern memory experts recommend creating stories using journeys or 3D as aids. Would legends, myths, and ritual do this in low literacy antiquity? agricultural cycles, cultural histories? Thank you to both. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand.
Why did they indulge, right? Why did they indulge in the cultic?
Well, so I mean, that's part of how we even know that it's. I mean, I'm going to take this in a direction that possibly JC wasn't intending, but just let me run for a second. So there are story patterns. So there are folklorists. We have I cover it in my book. People that study fairy tales and mythic stories, fictional stories. One of the things that distinguishes that from like a story about reality is that there's, especially in ancient time, is that there's story arc. There's there's kind of there's one scholar created 6 story arcs that are, for invented stories. And one of them is called the Cinderella story arc. And that's where the kind of the narrative is redeemed at the end by some, grand event that somehow reverses the whole thing. Right. And that's really kind of what we're getting in the Gospels in many ways. But the idea of a story is a powerful thing because it doesn't assume where someone's at. The listener could be at almost any level. It could be a child, a teen, somebody more sophisticated, less sophisticated. A story has that unique kind of dynamic to it that it can engage people at almost any level. You go see Shrek. Well, grown adult, a sophisticated someone who's seen the world can go and watch that and appreciate it on their level, and yet you could take a 6-year-old in there and they'll have a good time too.
Right? Like we go to the movies and purposely watch to entertain, but there's something psychological, I think, that's satisfying in that process too. So I imagine there is some truth to what JC's asking. I have like 10 minutes left and I don't want to leave anyone hanging. If that's okay, can we push forward? Okay. For Ocker, forgive me if I butchered your name. Love your work and your book. That's you, Dr. Miller. Have you had a discussion with Bart Ehrman about your ideas? Thank you.
It's kind of in all of my travels, I think I've talked to Bart Ehrman once or twice my whole life. And it was at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting. And maybe someday I'll be on the show with him or something like that here. I respect him greatly. I think he's an interesting. We both went to Princeton Seminary as a kind of a point of commonality there, and we're both also not religious in any way, and so we've got some common ground there. And I've seen his thoughts evolve over the years, just as mine have, and it just so happens that I've found a lot of common ground. I enjoy listening to him on a number of levels, and so. I'm not sure what his thoughts are exactly on my book. I think I've heard that he's read it, and I have seen in some of his podcasts and stuff references to parts of my arguments that they don't have to be my arguments, but arguments where we would agree necessarily. I think I was kind of original in some of this, but I'm happy to see anyone take up any of these arguments and run with them as their own in so many ways. And I think I've seen that to some extent with him. And so it wouldn't surprise me that if we sat down that he would find a lot of agreement with. I don't know, Derek, have you seen his perspectives on the resurrection? And what little I've seen seems like it would find at least some alignment with some of the views that
some of it. Yeah, there's certain things, especially the legendary tomb, this idea of the empty tomb being legendary, even though you are willing to entertain missing body as part of a forced coercive translation. But he takes the legendary tomb position. Other than that, some of it seems to be a little traditional in his argumentation. And then also how he understands Paul and stuff. And so those are different things that you and me have discussed off air a lot. And but you guys have a lot of overlap. And I think we're on the same side as it comes to just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Drinks, no question, just some love. Hallelujah. Great to see MythVision Live. Amazing guest.
It's awesome.
Subscribe to Deep Drinks. That's my boy David McDonald, and he's got some wonderful interviews over there, if I say so myself. And thank you for showering us with love, my friend. I appreciate the support. Inquisitive Mind. MythVision is the vaccine for this crazy world. Thank you so much, the ghost of MythVision. I appreciate you. Dr. Andy in the house with a 20. I really appreciate the love and support. I didn't see a question when you gave me that first super chat. I noticed that you had another one, but I didn't see a question, and I don't want to leave you hanging. So I'm going to try and scroll up and find it and see if underneath that you had dropped any questions, just so I don't leave you hanging. I hate doing that, and I don't like to leave anybody hanging here. So forgive me. Here we are. No, that's Peter. Okay. Just a little bit more. Almost there. Somewhere up here. Oh, there it is. Just some love. Inquisitive. Here we go. Andy, yeah, Andy, don't see a question, my friend. Thank you for that super chat. Appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure I try not to leave anyone hanging. Blake, do you think Jesus really told Peter he's the rock which he will build his church on? If not, where did the idea of Peter being the first pope come from? Thank you for the super chat.
This is quite a question. There's a lot there that goes on, and my mind just started to fire in all sorts of directions.
Yeah,
I think so. Mark, obviously, this is where we're first getting this, right? Is in Mark, and there's a lot going on in Mark in terms of it being a kind of a crafted early Christian myth, and so it is kind of the original, right? The original narrative and it's post 70, which is after the temple destruction in Jerusalem. But what often is overlooked is it's also post 64, and that's the Great Fire in Rome, where Peter was allegedly killed. And so he was killed, according to legends, under Nero, and so was Paul. And accused of, as the cult leaders for a group that was accused of starting that fire, and with confessors, according to Tacitus.
Yeah. Are you hinting at a book you might be writing?
So there's stuff going on there, but Peter he rises very early as kind of the chief trait in him, alongside with Paul, obviously. Peter and Paul, we talk about them. James also, and others. But so Peter ends up becoming, within that trajectory to Rome, sort of the pinnacle of that tradition that goes all the way back as one of Jesus' students. And so I think that particular passage was crafted in a way that would legitimate him in that. And so I do not think it goes back to historical kind of moment with Jesus.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question, Blake. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, my time is so, I don't want to be castrated like Uranus. So Dr. Andy, again, thank you for the super sticker, my friend. I really appreciate the love. And then Peter Boyle, thank you so much. I hope I pronounced your name properly there. I didn't see a comment underneath that. Let me double. Peter. Thank you so much for that. I don't see one. Sometimes I check because Dr. Miller, sometimes they'll super chat and then like there's a comment or something or a question. I just don't want to leave anybody. Thank you for the love and support. Lucas Hunt, what does mythology have to say about the naked youth in Mark? Ask Dennis that one, right?
Youth. Yeah, that is a Dennis question. It's, in my opinion, there are some questions that we just can't answer. And some of that is, I think, is just in our humility. In theology, there's the idea that we should be able to answer all the questions. Mm-hmm. And historians don't have that. They shouldn't anyway have that kind of hubris that we just know all about it. But there is something going on there. Now, I'm not accusing Dennis of hubris. I think he's got as good a theory as any. And one of the things I love about Dennis is he's willing to put his neck out there with certain kind of hypotheses and run with them. And he's got one regarding that. From my standpoint, I don't know exactly. I think that's part of the mystery, the enigmatic aspects of the narrative. Mark is almost like a fog machine of confusion. It's meant to be disorienting and not give you the answers, and speak in parables and leave unsettled mysteries right on the table there. And it's part of its narrative strategy. And many have talked about that in the past. And I almost would place this figure in that cast. I mean, I'm sure if you were on the inside, the outside, they get it all in parables. The inside, we get the actual story.
Right.
So sure if you were there with the originary, the apostolic folks that claim to understand this text and were carrying it forward in terms of their own interior teaching, that you'd have a very interesting description of that person. But I don't know, and so I defer to Dennis McDonald. He's got as good a theory as any on it. So
yeah, and then you have the secret gospel. Mark, you got all this stuff. So I have to hurry because the wife, I can hear her. Dicta89, you think Jesus was giving it to Mary Magdalene? I had to ask that one. I didn't really realize as I was reading it, but nonetheless,
that's awesome.
That's
no. Yeah, it starts to fall off the vanishing point. If you want to postulate regarding a historical Jesus and he had a relationship with someone named Mary Magdalene, there are plenty of scholars that have kind of speculated along those lines. Obviously, what was it, The Last Temptation, the movie came out a generation ago or whatever, is definitely playing with that idea, or that's central to its kind of the movie script.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. At that point, it's what I would say though is he had sexuality. If there was a dude,
he would have had to struggle with the same thing as any dude. Yeah,
the idea that he was asexual, I think, is off the table. That wouldn't be a healthy human being, and so.
Sit down, Zumak. Forgive me if I butchered that. What's Dr. Miller's opinion on Islam? Was it an outgrowth of some kind of heretical Christianity, neo-Jews? If Christianity is a myth, so is Islam, right?
Islam, it's interesting. So Christianity is basically a religion centered around Christ, or our figure. Islam is about the book. Muhammad is almost secondary in that sense. Christianity, it's supposed to be about Christ, and the book is secondary. I don't know that that's the case in every tradition. I think you've got plenty of biblicists that are elevating the book even higher than, some of them you kind of wonder if you brought Jesus down and he corrected them, if they would even accept that regarding their book, So they're so fixated on the book. But Islam has its own kind of origin story, its own mythology around where it arose. I did take a doctoral seminar on the history of the Quran and its interpretation. We did spend a couple weeks dealing with the origin story and unpacking that in different ways. It's enough to say, I think, that it's a product of its time in Arabia, and that in that world, it's got a lot of the same kind of poetic patterns, and scholars have unpacked that. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit difficult to study because it's taboo, and so I think in the Christian West, we're allowed to interrogate Christianity with full force often, whereas in the Islamic world, that's modulated quite a bit through the kind of the politics of the religion and the different pressures and forces that are there. But definitely, it was a religion with its own, as you would expect, it has confluence with what was prior. Zoroastrian was largely kind of the predecessor, Zoroastrianism, predecessor to Islam, with some Christian influence. But we just see the trajectory of Persian and Arabic religion coming into that time period and producing this kind of monotheistic system that was centered around the book.
Thank you. Jamie Waldron, thank you for the love, Jamie. Always there on Facebook, and I appreciate the love, my friend. Blackface Jimmy Kimmel, was Paul the inventor of Jesus Christianity?
Inventor? I think he was a very inventive person, a cult leader. He says so in Galatians 1 and 2. Go back and read it. It's very interesting that he says he didn't get any of his content by consulting with anyone, that it was revealed within him. And the word there is, apocalypto. It was an apocalypse within him, an internal revelation. He kind of sees himself as a prophet in that way, as somebody that's receiving kind of internal vision of reality and some special kind of connection with the mystical realities of his spiritual tradition, his culture tradition. So he's making stuff up. It's kind of a long way to get around that, from a secular humanist standpoint. As I look at that, would anyone in our modern time get away with that? Who would get away with that especially if they admitted it?
I was going to say some like gurus or cult leaders might, but I don't think they're going to tell you they're yeah.
Exactly. So it's a little bit like Dianetics or something in that way. You've got L. Ron Hubbard having these kind of insights into stuff that happened trillions of years ago. Anyway, so yeah, he's a cult leader and he's highly independent, and he tells you so. If you read Galatians there, he actually makes fun of the early tradents of the tradition, the so-called pillars in Palestine, the super apostles, as he mocks them. And so he thinks but I don't think he's responsible for the entirety of the tradition. I think what you get with the Gospels and further content into the 2nd century, some of which is in our New Testament, is an effort at reconciling all that into one kind of system that looks like it could sit in one basket together. And so,
thank you so much, Dr. Miller. Dr. Andy, again, thank you for this. Wasn't in case of Jesus, the resurrection, the trigger for the embellishment and the myths, whereas in case of others like Romulus or Dionysus, other reasons were present at the time to get them in that hall of fame. In case of Jesus, the resurrection, the trigger for the If I'm understanding your question correctly, because I'm a little confused, are you suggesting the crucifixion is the trigger for the embellishment? Or is there like a cognitive dissonance explanation or what? I guess it depends on whether you think that the historical Jesus. I'm a little confused by the question. Are you gathering?
Yeah. I think I see what he's saying. He's saying was that the impetus for the rise of Christianity? And I hear that a lot, that people say, if he didn't rise from the dead, then we wouldn't have a religion, right?
Right.
And the logic goes backwards then from there. Then therefore he must have risen from the dead because we have a religion. Otherwise it wouldn't happen, which is false, because we see all sorts of other cults rising and doing all sorts, having all sorts of success in the ancient world that had apotheosis stories and it wasn't necessary. And which comes first, right? That's the question. Mm-hmm. Was this bestowed upon him because he was significant, or was he significant because this was, something that actually happened or that was bestowed on him in terms of embellishment? It's a little of both in some ways. It didn't happen, I don't think. I mean, let's start with that. It's interesting that the story, especially the Markan content, the earliest we have of the story coming in narrative form is in Mark, okay? And in that text, it's part of the Markan secret. It's part of the stuff that's hushed. Like, don't tell anyone, they didn't tell anyone, and they ran to Galilee afraid, right? That's how the whole narrative ends. Well, why didn't they tell anyone? Why is that a necessary ending? That's a bizarre ending, by the way, but it made sense in the ancient world. A lot of abrupt endings to narratives in the ancient world. And so, but why didn't they tell anyone? Well, that explains why no one knew of this story for decades. Or that it didn't break until later and somewhere else, right? And so, so that's kind of, I think the best way to describe it is that it was a bestowed story. And Matthew, I see Matthew as a early second century text, but in there, you've got the alternative story of him being stolen by his disciples, lest the latter crime be worse than the first, or whatever they didn't want to accept it. So that was kind of the argument, was that this is an even bigger hoax than the original hoax, of Jesus himself as a person who gets killed as a pretender, right? And so, did they steal his body? Why would they do that? That's the question, really. Well, they would do it because they wanted him to be, okay, you killed him. We're going to install him in the Hall of Fame anyway. So we're going to steal his body and make sure that everyone has, that to give rise to this myth, to bestow on him the highest, most exalted myth, the same one that's bestowed on the Caesars even. And so, so they're taking a criminal, someone that's been charged. He committed a crime, the whip in the temple with driving out the money changers. Mm-hmm. I did that, if I went to the local mall or whatever and started doing something like that,
Or local courthouse, let's say. Yeah.
yeah, I could expect to spend the night in jail, and this is clearly crime.
I'd
And
imagine more than a night, but yeah.
yeah, and he, it's not an accident that a couple days later he's hanging on a cross, and so he gets prosecuted for that, and that was the sentence. And a lot of the Gospels want to make it into a different kind of story. Well, he's this or that, or he's making all these claims, but if that crime hadn't happened, I don't think the story would have. That's what precipitated it. And so, anyway, I'm going a roundabout way just to say that it's a bestowal, I think, on their hero in order to redeem what would otherwise be completely disgraceful. That is his execution as a common criminal.
Two things, just mentioning that, and then we have Aaron Adair. I'm gonna go ahead and pop his up to make a point about this, though. Thank you, Dr. Adair. Get his books as well. I've done documentaries highlighting his work. He's a scientist and he's an enthusiast. You could call him an amateur Bible scholar, if you will. And I really, really love learning from him as well. Thank you for that. But just pointing that out, you play around with both possibilities. Complete legend, where they would have concocted a narrative where his body went missing, because we have all these narratives where bodies go missing, and we aren't saying those are historical. There may be accounts in antiquity, like Alexander the Great, we've heard, right? Tries to throw himself in the river. Why? To get rid of his own body at his death. So people would think the gods must have took him. And there's a contemporaneous story of Callirhoe it's like a poetic kind of, what is it? A novel, something like that. And the man who loves her is going to her tomb because she had died, or they thought, and grave robbers took her and took her off, and they go in the tomb and she's missing. And he starts going, oh, which one of you gods envied me and took her from me? That was my love. And he wanted to also be taken, but immediately her body's missing. And he thought one of the gods took her. That was the immediate signal. And that's why you're saying in your work, parallels are cool and fun and possible and even likely. The stronger there's some parallel significance, and you can maybe see they're in the same genre, maybe even the milieu, they're written in Greek, things like that, like Dennis MacDonald might show, or others might parallel certain things. But you're also saying the linguistic fabric that you're looking at, you can't escape what we're talking about with legend, myth. It is a linguistic thing. So the final question in that vein, this is a perfect launch off with Dr. Andy and with the 440 people watching right now. And that is this. I've had apologists that I've encountered and engaged having conversations. I don't like debates because I don't care for dick measuring contest. I'm going to keep it very blunt and honest. I don't care for that. I really don't. I'm interested in conversation, and good faith conversation, not, I got you, haha. But I ask, how can you not see, to some of the apologists, like my friend Michael Jones and some of the other guys, how can you not see that when you have guys being born of not just virgins, right? They are virgin births as well, like Perseus mentioned by Justin Martyr. The list can go on and on. We have, like you said, Alexander the Great. We have the birth of Plato, which is mentioned in Plutarch, virgin births, but also miraculous divine births, endless ones with Zeus and Apollo, and the list goes on, Suetonius. And we have miracles of raising the dead by Heracles, by Isis, by Asclepius, big time. We have healing the blind. Same characters I just named also do all that. Dionysus turning water into wine. List goes on and on and on. How do you not realize this is fiction that we're talking about with Jesus? And they go, this is the one that actually happened historically. And they'll give weird analogies about, there was a fiction written about a ship that sank in maybe 1898. I'm just throwing out a number there, date, I don't know. And then therefore, it kind of predicts in a way, a lot of parallels to finding the Titanic ship that actually historically sunk. And I told them, I want your comments. I said, if Titanic sunk and 3 days later, with all the members on it, it resurrected from the bottom of the sea and everybody on it was alive, then we'd have a miracle, in my opinion. But
right,
what is this anyway? What do
you about? Well, it's extraordinary claims, like Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right?
Right.
Now, that evidence is not forthcoming in the Christian tradition. Instead, what they're doing is basically giving analog or instances of many of the same. These are story patterns that were vividly present in the ancient mind, and they're drawing on that left and right throughout the gospel tradition. And the earliest writers, the receivers like Justin Martyr, admit as much.
Yeah.
They go ahead and deal with it as such. And so this idea then that this is this kind of sui generis, that's what the kind of one of a kind story that otherwise didn't exist. You know, I've seen so many different apologists try and argue this. Well, you don't even need apologists if this were plainly the case. You don't need like an army of people defending. You just don't. It's because the tradition's being propped up. It happens to be Western sacred mythology and a living religion. And so there are a variety of people that are trying to defend that tooth and nail, even to the point of absurdity. And so if you get back into the ancient texts and see what's going on, they're running a cult right alongside the other cults right down the lane. If you go to Corinth, Alexandria, Ephesus, Rome, any of these cities, they're following a lot of the same stock patterns and these same story patterns. And the story of Jesus is fitting in with a lot of the same narrative contours that we're getting with any of the other major iconic figures in that cultural kind of context. And so for us to be mistaken on that is really our fault at that point.
Yeah. Or willingly indulging in the myth of thinking that it's not. But just final super chat here. Forgive JC over here. JC, I got to go. Intrigued by Daniel Unterbrink's hypotheses of Jesus as a mashup of real Judas of Galileans, documented zealot actions like temple cleanse, plus Paul's visions, plus mimesis by Marcion and gospel authors. Thoughts?
That's a whole nother show.
A whole nother show to discuss. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave you hanging, but I really think maybe we can have another hangout and maybe address go more into the weeds. I don't want to get divorced if that's okay with everybody, you know. What do you say?
The queen doth call. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you my thoughts here. It's interesting. It's interesting to see that Judas Galilean actually cleanses the temple. Okay. Did the gospel authors lift this Judean figure who did actually cleanse the temple and then paint that onto Jesus? We don't know. Did Jesus really cleanse the temple? We don't know. I mean, we can say what a text says, but we don't know if that happened or didn't. And that's why reconstructions of the historical Jesus are like, you know, interesting, fun, but speculative. And to know what actually happened is just going to be, you know, depending on the scholar's view. So, and then Jamie Waldron, again, thank you so much. I personally have to go, Dr. Miller, but I just want to say, for me, I really value your information. I love learning from you. People can read your book. It's in the description if you can afford it. If you can't afford it, you can get a version, even though the sources are extensive in your book and they really go deep. But if you can't afford it, you can watch a documentary that gives you a very simplified breakdown of much of what is said in there. But sometimes when you break language down into smaller forms to try and simplify it, you might lose some of the depth that is actually there in that book. It's a magnum opus of resurrection reception, just hits it hard. So final words from you.
I appreciate you, sir. I appreciate the charts that you created and shared within this live stream. That is worth the price alone of the documentary, just to see those charts. I should have consulted with you when I wrote the book, because that would have added a lot of clarity for people. But you did a really wonderful job presenting that documentary. And
if you would have consulted me, I would have hated you at the time, because I was super fundamentalist. When you published it, I probably would have been like, "You're from Satan. Are you kidding me?" I started a poll at the beginning and just said, "Do you see the legend in the New Testament?" And 71% said yes, 28% said no, 379 votes. So I appreciate you, everyone. Thank you. I'll try and do more lives more often. We'll see. I've got some stuff coming up. Stay tuned, and thank you.